Tap, tap, tap. Katie stared at her door, a cardigan from the hamper pulled around her shoulders. The tapping had started more than 10 minutes prior. Not knocking, not some cops banging, but something akin to a tepid child. Saliva congealed in her throat, clinging to her mouth and tongue like gobs of wet tissue paper. She turned on her bathroom light, so as to not be completely in the dark, but she resisted the urge to flick on the fluorescent light hanging over the 300 square feet that constituted her bedroom and living space. Getting a studio apartment had seemed like such a great idea while she suffered with her roommates, who wouldn't do dishes or take out the garbage. But now, at 3:43 in the morning, she couldn't help but wish Brianna was still texting with her boyfriend one room over. At least then, she wouldn't be alone. Tap, tap, tap. Katie swallowed hard. The deadbolt was still snapped into place. No matter what was on the other side of the door, she was safe as long as that was true. Creeping toward the door, Katie took great care to avoid the squeaky parts of the faux wood floor. Then, with her palms pressed lightly against the door for balance, she lifted up onto her tiptoes and peered through the peephole. Standing outside was a bald man in a black suit. A smile split his face, and a perfect row of teeth glinted under the hallway light's fluorescent glow. Stapled to his eyes were squares of gauze, and Katie noticed, as her throat grew dry and coarse, that he had no tongue. She saw the severed flesh bobbing around behind his perfectly straight teeth. A tear streaked down his right eye. Without peering at her neighbor's door behind him, or at the doors on either side of Katie's apartment, he lifted his finger and tapped on the door. Katie shrank back from the door. She had two options. Well, three, but two were tied together. One, she could go back to bed, plug in her headphones, and watch YouTube while keeping one eye focused on the door's deadbolt. Two, she could call the cops. And three, she could ask the man if he needed help. Of course, option 3 twisted her gut, and she knew sleep was impossible with option 1. Plus, even if she did call the cops and they came in a reasonable time, what if the man was mentally ill, homeless, or in need of dire medical attention? Her thoughts shifted to the man's eyes, gauze stapled over them, his severed tongue, a tear streaking down his cheek. God damn it, she thought, letting out a precarious sigh. Sir, do you need help? She asked, her voice shaking. She peered through the peephole, and a yelp squirmed free from her mouth. Katie clapped both hands around her mouth as fast as she could, but the sound had been as shrill and audible as a bunny's dying squeak. The one square of gauze stared back at her, where the man's left eye should have been. Tap, tap, tap. Another tear welled and spilled free, and the man's smile spread wider. The wedge of severed tongue wriggled. He stepped back from the door, and he knelt. Katie stepped back. The deadbolt was fastened, but how many severe hits with a shoulder would the door take? What if he had a weapon? 1,000 unsolved mysteries episodes ran through her head. No, now was the time to call. Something tearing. A scrap of paper? And then, under her door, she noticed a rectangle of just that, paper, sliding her way. Confusion and fear intermingled. She knelt, picked up the paper, and read what was written on it. May I have your eyes? She dropped it as though maggots were writhing on the black ink. Listen, she snarled through the door. I'm about to call the cops. If you try anything, I've got a gun and I know how to shoot it. Not true in the slightest, but she did have a selection of fancy Ginsu knives her rich uncle had bought her for a birthday present the year before. Another tearing sound, and the second slip of paper whispered under her door. Please, may I have your eyes? Katie peered through the peephole again, convinced this was some sort of sick joke. That Jason, her on-again, off-again boyfriend, had found a willing participant in a hokey prank. The kind of thing she'd see on YouTube, with obnoxious capital letters. But even as she thought that, Katie noticed a trickle of blood spilling around the staples that held the gauze over the man's eyes. Another piece of paper. She glanced at the peephole again. The man waited, his smile somehow even wider than before. The skin around the edges of his lips was thin, as if threatening to tear open, and more tears tumbled free from under the gauze. She knelt, picked up the paper, and turned it over. Messier penmanship. "It will be quick." Katie huffed. She was getting pissed now. With a quick motion, she tossed the paper aside and peered through the peephole again. "Listen, I'm not—" Her words stopped cold in her throat. The man pulled off one of the gauze squares, still smiling. Blood welled and dribbled down his cheekbone, pebbling the floor with rapid sounds. The staple stuck in his flesh, refusing to be torn away. But even as his eyelid twisted and bent and ripped, the man didn't stop. Underneath the gauze, in place of an eye, was a pinprick of light, like a candle set deep in a house, barely visible. When his eyelid was ripped off, and the gauze lay against his cheek, still held in place at the bottom, he peered into the peephole. Katie stood, transfixed by the light. Something in the back of her brain misfired, like a timing belt, clipping to indicate something was severely wrong, but she couldn't help herself. The light twisted this way and that, and she remained focused on it even when the man put both hands in his mouth. Her hand brushed the deadbolt, and she grasped it, even as the man used one hand to pull his mouth upright and one hand to wrench his jaw downward. A dribble of saliva spilled down her bottom lip as she snapped the deadbolt into the unlocked position, even as a horrendous sound filled the hallway, something between squelching mud and crushed cockroaches. And the man pulled apart his smile like he was preparing to unveil a cantaloupe's innards. Blood splashed the floor, and teeth clattered across the tile like frozen corn kernels. Muscle and ligament tore apart, and still the man pulled, that patch of gauze flapping against his cheek. All Katie could see was the light, which was growing brighter by the second. She didn't even realize she was drooling. Her hand slipped to the knob. It felt so cool and comfortable against her palm. What harm was there in opening the door? She twisted and she pulled, and the man's body crumbled to the ground, useless. While Katie still thought about the light, how quaint it had been, how much it had reminded her of her grandmother. A mist shifted up from the pile of blood and bone, like a cloud of gnats. Up, up, up it went, and then, in a motion that was eerily violent, and yet somehow beautiful, the cloud shot at Katie, sliding up into her mouth, up her nostrils, behind her eyes. A buzzing sound filled her head, but it quickly morphed into a calm, feminine voice. Dark as oil, seductive as amber whiskey, dripping with honey, biting with venom. "Thank you," the voice said. "Now, where are your scissors?" Katie turned and marched towards Uncle Brandon's fancy knife set. Within the block of ornate wood sat a pair of scissors. She'd used them once before to break down a chicken. With a confident grip, she pulled them free. "Now, let's see that lovely tongue of yours." Katie stuck it out, lifted the scissors, parted the blades, and placed them around the waggling pink flesh. She didn't even wince when they came crashing through.